Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The room buzzed with chatter, officers in crisp uniforms, junior airmen flipping through binders, colonels trading quiet jokes only they found funny. And in the corner sat Angela Torres, not sitting at the table, not in the circle of influence, but near the back behind the steel coffee urn and paper cups. She wasn't even supposed to be there, just cleaning up after the long morning. No one looked at her. No one even paused. To them, she was background noise, a woman with rubber gloves and a mop bucket, invisible by design. And yet, what they didn't know, what no one in that room could guess, was that she had once carried a weight heavier than all their polished metals combined. But Angela said nothing. She never did. She lowered her eyes, wiped the coffee stain from the table, and waited for the laughter to quiet down. She knew how this worked. She had been walking these halls for years now, as the janitor, as the woman in faded green coveralls with bleach-stained knees and boots that squeaked on tile floors. And still, in some quiet, unshakable way, she carried herself like a soldier. It wasn't obvious to them, but the posture was there. Shoulders squared, chin level, eyes steady when they dared to meet hers, not out of arrogance, out of memory, out of training that never left her body. Yet they ignored her. They always ignored her. Until one day, everything changed. But before we get there, you have to understand why. Why a four-star general stopped in his tracks. Why he turned an entire hallway silent. Why he raised his hand to his brow in front of captains, majors, and sergeants who had no idea what they were witnessing, and saluted the woman they thought was just the janitor. To understand that, we go back. Her name was Angela Torres. She had grown up in New Mexico, where the desert stretched wide and quiet, and the sky belonged to aircraft that thundered low over the horizon. Her father used to pause at the screen door every time one passed, pointing at the contrails like they were brushstrokes of history being written. Angela never forgot that feeling, the hum in her chest when engines tore across the sky. By 17, she had enlisted. By 19, she was already elbow-deep in turbine parts most recruits were too intimidated to touch. But her career wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind that made recruiting posters. She wasn't a fighter pilot, wasn't a sniper, wasn't the soldier breaching doors in Hollywood films. She was a mechanic. And yet mechanics keep people alive. Angela knew it in her bones. If her hands faltered, if her judgment slipped, a plane that lifted off might not return. That weight lived with her, every shift, every rotation. She served 22 years under that weight. Afghanistan, Iraq, airstrips so close to mortar fire that dust kicked up with every distant thud. There were nights she rebuilt engines by flashlight while the sky trembled with incoming rockets. She remembered how one young pilot, barely old enough to buy a beer back home, had clutched her shoulder before takeoff and whispered, "Just keep her together, Torres. Just one more run." He came back. His squadron came back, because she made sure the machine carried them home. That was her war. Not with a rifle, but with wrenches and torque gauges and hands blistered from cold steel. And then it ended. 22 years, and suddenly she was retired. A box of medals, a folded flag, a certificate that looked impressive until the bills started arriving, until the silence of her apartment became unbearable, until she realized the military had been her family, and now that family had moved on without her. So she came back, to the base, not in uniform this time, not as Technical Sergeant Torres, but as a civilian janitor. It was humiliating at first. The same halls she once walked with authority now walked with a mop. The same hangars where young airmen used to snap to attention at her voice, now echoing with their laughter as they passed her without a glance. She thought she could handle it, thought she could swallow the pride, focus on the paycheck. But pride isn't something you bury easily. She scrubbed toilets, emptied trash, wiped down tables in briefing rooms where she once briefed others, and every day she told herself the same thing: you're not here for recognition. You're here because work is work. And dignity doesn't come from their eyes, it comes from how you carry yourself. Still, loneliness gnawed at her. She was in her late 50s now. The military had taken her youth, her energy, her best years. And when she looked in the mirror, sometimes she barely recognized herself. The tired eyes, the calloused hands, the woman who used to command respect now blending into the background like a shadow. But Angela never complained, never demanded. She just kept showing up early before the sun cracked the horizon. She polished the floors. She hummed old Spanish hymns her mother once sang, and when the airmen left their trash behind, she picked it up without resentment. They didn't know her story. They didn't ask. And maybe, deep down, she believed no one ever would. Until that day. It was supposed to be routine. A four-star general was visiting the base, Commander Anthony Griggs. The name alone stirred chaos. The place buzzed with nervous energy, officers barking orders to polish every corner, every desk, every doorknob. They wanted the base spotless. Angela didn't need the reminder. She had already been at work since dawn. By the time the convoy rolled through the gates, she was cleaning the hallway outside the general's temporary office. Just another day, another mop, another silence. She heard the voices before she saw him. Sharp, clipped, deferential. Colonels jockeying for position, majors straightening their collars. And then the hallway grew tense. Angela didn't look up at first. She didn't need to. She'd seen men like this before. Inspections, visits, flybys, they came and went, faces she never remembered. So she kept her eyes on the floor, pushing the mop, letting them pass. But then something strange happened. The footsteps slowed. Stopped. Angela lifted her head. General Griggs was staring at her. For a second she thought she'd done something wrong. Maybe she was in the way. Maybe he wanted her gone. She froze, mop handle trembling in her grip. The corridor around her went silent. Officers exchanged nervous glances. What was happening? And then the general walked directly toward her. The crowd parted. Boots clicked on tile. Every eye followed him, confused, curious. He stopped in front of her. And for the first time in over a decade, someone called her by the name she thought the world had forgotten. "Sergeant Torres," he said. The word struck her like a thunderclap. She blinked, stunned, her chest tightening. She hadn't heard her rank in years, not since she packed away her uniform in a cedar trunk, hidden in the back of her closet. The general's voice was steady, his eyes sharp but softened by something only she could recognize: memory. "I remember you," he continued. "Kuwait, 2003. You trained me on turbine repairs. I was a young captain then, green as they come. You probably don't remember, but I never forgot." Angela's mouth went dry. She searched his face, and suddenly, the memory came rushing back. A younger man, nervous, fumbling with a torque wrench. His hands shaking until she steadied them, teaching him the rhythm of bolts and gauges. She had teased him once, calling him kid, though he outranked her. And he had laughed, embarrassed but grateful. And now here he was, a four-star general standing in front of her. Then came the moment no one expected. General Griggs straightened his posture, raised his hand, and saluted her. The corridor gasped, colonels froze, captains stared, lieutenants whispered under their breath, a four-star general saluting the janitor. Angela's eyes stung, her throat clenched. Slowly, instinctively, her own hand rose in return, trembling but steady enough to meet his. And in that instant, she was invisible no more. What did that salute mean? Why would a man with stars on his shoulders stop for a woman others dismissed as a nobody? Because he remembered. Because sometimes the truest heroes aren't the ones standing in front of cameras, but the ones behind the machines that make survival possible. Angela lowered her hand, breath shaky, and for a moment, just a moment, the base remembered her too. But what Angela didn't know then, what she couldn't have guessed, was that this moment would reopen doors she thought were closed forever. That one salute would ripple outward, forcing her to confront memories she had buried. Memories of nights when the engines roared and the ground shook, and she questioned whether she would survive long enough to finish tightening the last bolt. And deep inside, a quiet question stirred again. Had her service ever really been forgotten? Or had it been waiting, just waiting for the right moment to be seen? What happens after the salute fades? The hallway had erupted in whispers the moment the general walked on. But now, it was silent. Officers who had ignored Angela for years suddenly shifted uncomfortably, as if ashamed. Eyes darted, hands fidgeted, but no one spoke. The only sound was the faint squeak of her mop bucket wheel against the tile, rocking gently where she had left it. Angela stood frozen. A salute like that, public, deliberate, wasn't a gesture you brushed aside. It wasn't small talk. It was acknowledgement. An acknowledgement for someone who had lived invisible felt heavier than a metal pin to her chest. The general dropped his hand. His gaze lingered, steady, almost protective. Then he gave a faint nod, a soldier's nod, the kind that said more than words ever could. He turned away, resuming his inspection. But the damage was done. The base had seen. Angela lowered her arm, fingers trembling. She didn't know what to do next. Part of her wanted to run, to disappear into the maintenance closet and slam the door. Another part wanted to stand taller, let them all stare, let them all wonder who she really was. But she didn't. She just picked up her mop and kept working. It was easier that way. Yet deep inside, something shifted. A door she had locked long ago cracked open, and memory, unforgiving, uninvited, slipped through. The desert came back first. Kuwait, the smell of fuel mixed with sand, the oppressive heat pressing down on her lungs, even at night. She had been stationed there during the height of the conflict, when supply lines were stretched thin and every sortie mattered. Engines arrived broken, shredded from dust, strained from constant overuse. It was her job to bring them back to life. She remembered one evening in particular, the night she first met Anthony Griggs. He was a captain then, too clean, too polished, like someone who had spent more time in classrooms than hangars. His hands shook when he held a torque wrench, his voice cracked when he barked orders. She had smirked at him, not out of disrespect, but out of recognition. She had seen 100 officers like him, bright, ambitious, but untested. That night a C-130 engine had failed mid-flight. The crew barely made it back. The hangar was chaos, men shouting, mechanics scrambling. Angela had stepped forward, barking instructions with the authority of someone who knew machines better than she knew people. Griggs had watched her, listened, learned. She taught him not by rank but by survival. Engines don't care about your stars, she told him once. Engines care about your hands, your patience, your respect. And maybe that stuck. Because 20 years later, he still remembered her. The flashback ended as quickly as it came, leaving Angela staring at the gleaming tile floor she had just mopped. She blinked hard, forcing herself back into the present. But the whispers followed her everywhere. That evening when she clocked out, she could feel the eyes of younger airmen trailing her. Some respectful, some confused, some even doubtful. Was the general serious? Could the janitor really have been someone of value? Angela ignored them. She walked to her car, the same dented sedan she had driven for 15 years, and slid behind the wheel. The seatbelt buckle was cracked, the air freshener long faded. She gripped the wheel tight and sat there for a long moment before turning the key. Recognition was dangerous. Recognition meant people might start asking questions, and Angela wasn't sure she was ready to answer them. The truth was complicated. She carried pride, but also scars. Because behind the medals, behind the years of service, there were memories she never shared. Memories that woke her at night in cold sweats, her chest tight, her ears ringing with the echo of engines roaring. There was one mission she could never forget. It was Afghanistan, early 2000s. An F-16 had landed hard, its right engine trailing smoke. Pilots staggered out, shaken but alive. Angela had been called to the flight line immediately. She ran with her tools clattering, dust kicking up around her boots. The engine was mangled, bleeding oil. She knew the damage meant weeks of downtime, maybe longer, but Command didn't want downtime. They wanted that bird flying again by sunrise. A mission was scheduled. A convoy needed cover. Lives depended on it. Angela argued. She told them the engine needed more than a quick fix, that pushing it could risk the pilot's life. But pressure crushed down on her. Orders snapped like whips. Do it. Make it work. So she did. She worked through the night, welding, patching, praying. Her hands shook from fatigue. Her lips bled from biting down, holding her anger inside. And when dawn came, the jet roared to life again. The pilot saluted her on the tarmac before taxiing away. Hours later, the radio call came in. The F-16 hadn't made it back. Something inside her broke that day. Angela had followed the orders. She had done what was demanded. But deep down, she knew, if she'd had more time, if she'd pushed harder against Command, maybe the outcome would have been different. Maybe that young man would still be alive. The medal they gave her afterward felt like an insult. She stuffed it in a box, buried it under old uniforms, and never looked at it again. That was the weight she carried. The unspoken guilt. The reason she never corrected people when they dismissed her as just a janitor. Because maybe, in her mind, she believed they were right. Maybe she didn't deserve to be remembered. But General Griggs had remembered anyway. And that unsettled her more than being forgot ever had. Back in her apartment that night, Angela sat at the kitchen table with a cup of instant coffee gone cold. The silence pressed in on her, heavy. She stared at the stack of unpaid bills, the faded photographs of her unit taped to the refrigerator, the box of medals gathering dust in the closet. Why now, she wondered, why did he have to say her name? Her hands shook as she pressed them together. She could still feel the salute, like electricity in her veins, a gesture that reopened wounds she wasn't ready to expose. The truth was, she had been living as a ghost, and ghosts aren't meant to be seen. But now she had been seen. And once you're seen, you can't go back to being invisible. The next morning at work, things were different, subtle but different. Officers nodded at her in the hallway. A few even whispered greetings. One young airman held a door for her, stammering, "Ma'am." She wanted to tell him not to call her that she wasn't anyone worth the title, but she couldn't bring herself to correct him. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Was this respect or just curiosity? Did they see her, or only the shadow of what the general's salute meant? Angela didn't have the answer. But she knew one thing. The past she had tried so hard to bury was clawing its way back, and she couldn't run from it forever. Not after that salute. What happens when the silence of a lifetime is suddenly broken? The salute still lingered in Angela's mind, like a bell struck once but echoing endlessly. She replayed it again and again, the general's steady hand, his voice calling her Sergeant Torres, the stunned expressions of everyone in that hallway. It felt unreal, like she'd imagined the entire thing, but the stares that followed her proved it had been very real. For the first time in years, people at the base noticed her. Noticed her when she swept past them with her mop bucket. Noticed her when she pushed open the cafeteria doors. Noticed her when she moved quietly between offices, emptying trash and wiping down desks. But noticing isn't always kindness. Some looked at her with respect, a new awareness in their eyes. Others looked at her with suspicion, as if wondering how much of the general's words were true. And then there were those who looked at her with annoyance, as though the salute had disrupted an unspoken order, that janitors stay janitors, and generals salute only those who fit neatly into the hierarchy. Angela felt the weight of every stare. It pressed on her back like a rucksack she couldn't set down. She tried to ignore it. She tried to tell herself nothing had changed. She scrubbed the same floors, clocked the same hours, hummed the same quiet hymns under her breath. But the truth was undeniable. Things had changed. At lunch one afternoon, a young airman approached her timidly. He couldn't have been more than 19. His uniform was fresh, creases sharp, boots too clean. He shifted awkwardly, tray in hand, before blurting out, "Excuse me, ma'am, were you really a mechanic in the Air Force?" Angela froze, spoon halfway to her mouth. She hated questions. Questions led to answers, and answers led to memories she wasn't ready to unearth. But the boy's eyes were earnest, wide, the way hers once had been. "Yes," she said quietly, "for 22 years. His face lit up. "That's amazing. I didn't know. I just thought." "You thought I was just a janitor," she finished for him, not cruelly, just stating a fact. The boy's ears burned red. "I didn't mean." Angela shook her head. "It's all right. That's what everyone thinks." He hesitated, then sat down across from her. Bold, naive. The kind of move only the young attempt without realizing what it might cost them. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "What was it like, being out there, fixing planes under fire?" Angela stared at him. She wanted to say nothing to push him away, but instead words slipped out. "Loud," she said simply. "Dust everywhere, engines screaming. Sometimes you'd tighten a bolt and wonder if it would hold long enough to bring someone back alive. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't." The boy swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say after that, and Angela was grateful. But that night, lying awake in her apartment, she cursed herself for answering. The memory she had tried so hard to bury, the F-16, the mission, the loss, came flooding back with brutal clarity. She turned on the lamp, pressed her palms against her eyes, and whispered, "Stop." But memories don't stop when commanded. They bleed through. She remembered the pilot's laugh before takeoff, the way he winked at the ground crew, full of bravado. She remembered the silence after the radio call, the way no one looked at her when the news broke. She remembered locking herself in the hangar bathroom and retching until her throat burned. And most of all, she remembered how no one comforted her. No one said, "You did your best." Because in the military, results matter more than effort, and the result had been failure. Angela carried that failure like a scar, hidden under layers of silence. Now, after the salute, silence was no longer an option. 2 days later, her supervisor called her into the office. He was a civilian contractor too, a man more interested in schedules and checklists than stories. He cleared his throat, tapping a pen against the desk. "I've been getting feedback," he said. Angela stiffened. "Feedback?" He avoided her eyes. "About you, about the general. People are talking. Some think it was a mistake, some think it was a big deal. Either way, it's disrupting workflow. I just need you to keep a low profile." Angela almost laughed. A low profile. She had been living in shadows for years, but now suddenly she was too visible. "I wasn't trying to cause anything," she said quietly. "I know," he muttered, "but sometimes attention's a problem." She nodded once, stood, and left without another word. That night she opened the cedar trunk in her closet. The smell of old wood and mothballs filled the air. Inside were the remnants of her other life. Uniforms folded with precision, ribbons still pinned to bars, photographs yellowing at the edges. And at the bottom, the box she swore she'd never open again. Her hands shook as she lifted it out. Inside, the metal glinted dully under the lamp, a commendation for extraordinary service under duress. The one they gave her after the mission that had cost a pilot his life. She clenched her jaw, picked it up, and nearly hurled it across the room. But she didn't. She just stared at it, her reflection warped in the tarnished metal. Was this what Griggs remembered? Was this what the salute was for? Or was he saluting something she no longer believed about herself? Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, Angela sat at the table, staring at the metal until dawn cracked pale over the horizon. The next day, the whispers grew louder. Some officers greeted her with cautious respect. Others ignored her even harder than before, as if determined to erase the moment by sheer force of will. And then came the strangest shift of all. A request. An officer from Training Command approached her during her shift. His voice was stiff, his tone clipped. "Sergeant Torres," he began, though she noticed the hesitation before he used her rank. "We're updating a maintenance module for new recruits. General Griggs suggested you might have input." Angela blinked. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't been asked for input in over a decade. She opened her mouth to refuse, to remind him she was just the janitor now, but the word caught in her throat. Instead, she said softly, "I'll think about it." That night she lay awake again. Only this time her thoughts weren't haunted by failure. They were haunted by possibility. What if she said yes? What if she taught again, passed on what she knew? Could she bear the weight of that responsibility again? Could she risk being seen, really seen, after years of hiding in plain sight? She didn't know. But deep inside the question pulsed, insistent, impossible to ignore. Was the salute just a memory? Or was it an invitation? How long can someone hide when the world suddenly turns its eyes toward them? Angela asked herself that question every morning after the general's salute. She tried to return to routine, to vanish back into the background, but the base would not let her. Everywhere she walked, conversations faltered, eyes followed, whispers trailed behind her like shadows. She hated it. Recognition was heavier than loneliness. Yet the weight carried something else too, an ember she thought had long gone cold, the ember of purpose. The request to help with training modules still lingered in her mind. She'd avoided answering, sidestepped the officer's polite but awkward invitation. But the thought clung to her. It haunted her even as she swept floors, even as she scrubbed toilets, even as she drove home to the silent apartment that waited like a tomb. Was this what Griggs intended? Did he mean to pull her back into the fold? Or had his salute been nothing more than a memory wrapped in ceremony, an acknowledgement of the past but nothing more? Angela didn't know, but the uncertainty burned. That night she pulled the cedar trunk closer and began sorting through her old uniforms. The smell of starch, long faded, still clung faintly to the fabric. She ran her fingers along the stripes on the sleeve. Master Sergeant, a rank earned through years of sweat and sacrifice, now reduced to cloth pressed flat against cedar. She pressed the sleeve to her face, closing her eyes. For a moment she was back there on the line under the floodlights, engines howling, tools clattering, voices shouting over the roar. She felt alive there, needed, essential. And then she remembered the silence that followed when a jet never came home. Her chest tightened. The metal on the table gleamed in the lamplight, cruel and mocking. She pushed the uniform back into the trunk and shut it hard, as if slamming a door on ghosts. But ghosts don't stay locked away. The next day her supervisor cornered her again. "About that training request," he said, shuffling papers. "They're persistent. They want you to at least sit in, share experience. I told them you'd think about it, but they're not letting it go." Angela frowned. "Why me? There are plenty of mechanics still active." "Yes," he said slowly, "but none that a four-star general just publicly saluted." The words landed like a hammer. So that was it, not her skill, not her experience. Her usefulness now came from someone else's recognition, from a salute. She wanted to spit at the thought, but another part of her, quieter, deeper, whispered something different. Maybe it doesn't matter why they asked. Maybe it matters what you do with it. She didn't answer him. She just nodded, turned, and left. That night she couldn't sleep. Again. She tossed in bed, staring at the ceiling, until finally she rose, threw on a sweater, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the stars scattered across the sky like shards of glass. She stood in the parking lot, staring up, listening to the faint hum of aircraft in the distance. Her chest tightened at the sound. Even after retirement, even after years of sweeping floors, the The sound of an engine at altitude still stirred something fierce in her blood. She whispered into the night, voice hoarse, "What do you want from me?" The stars didn't answer, but the question echoed inside her all the same. 2 days later, she walked into the training hangar. It wasn't a decision she announced. She just showed up, coveralls faded and mop bucket set aside for the morning. The officer who had requested her blinked in surprise, then quickly ushered her in. The recruits were gathered in rows, notebooks in hand, eyes half-lidded with the fatigue of classroom lectures. Angela stood awkwardly at the edge, unsure of what to say. "This is Sergeant Torres," the officer began, emphasizing her old rank. "She'll be sharing some perspective today." Dozens of eyes turned to her, curious, skeptical, some respectful, some dismissive. Angela swallowed hard. For a moment, words refused to come. She considered walking out, retreating before she humiliated herself. But then she saw the boy from the cafeteria, the one who had asked her what it was like out there. He was sitting in the front row, notebook open, waiting. And the ember in her chest flared. She stepped forward, her voice low but steady. "Engines," she began, "don't care about your rank. They don't care about your medals or your speeches. They care about your hands and your respect." The room fell quiet. Angela went on. She told them about the desert heat, about the way sand could eat through turbines like acid. She described the nights when rockets lit up the horizon, and she worked by flashlight, tightening bolts with shaking hands. She spoke of pilots whose lives depended on her judgment, on the way she listened to the hum of a machine and knew when it wasn't right. She didn't dramatize, didn't exaggerate. She just told the truth, stripped bare and unpolished. And for the first time in years, she felt the room listening. The recruits leaned in. Pens scratched furiously across paper. Even the officer at her side seemed transfixed, as if hearing war from a vantage point he had never considered. When she finished, silence held for a long moment. Then the boy in the front row whispered almost reverently, "Thank you." Angela's throat tightened. She nodded once, then stepped back, retreating to the edge of the hangar. She had spoken for less than 20 minutes. But in that 20 minutes, she had remembered what it felt like to be seen, not as a janitor, not as a ghost, but as someone who mattered. That night she sat at her kitchen table again. But this time, the metal on the table didn't mock her. It glimmered with a different light, a reminder not of failure but of survival. Still, the guilt didn't vanish. It never would. The pilot lost, the silence that followed, the weight she carried, that was hers alone. But for the first time in years, the weight didn't feel like a chain. It felt like armor. And as she sat in the quiet, a thought rose, clear and undeniable. Maybe being remembered isn't about glory. Maybe it's about passing on what you know, so someone else doesn't have to carry the same regrets. Angela exhaled, a slow breath that seemed to empty years of silence from her chest. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. She wasn't sure if she was ready to step fully out of the shadows. But one thing was certain, she had been seen. And once seen, you can't go back to being invisible. What happens when the shadows you've lived in for years refuse to take you back? Angela had thought the training session would be a one-time thing, a fluke. She would speak, they would listen, and then she could retreat again into the quiet anonymity of mop buckets and empty hallways. But it didn't happen that way. Word spread fast, too fast. Within days, other officers began reaching out. Maintenance crews asked if she could walk the hangars, check their work. Training command requested her notes on turbine failure. Even a group of mechanics still active in the field sent word they wanted her perspective on their new troubleshooting guide. Angela wasn't ready for this. She had spent years convincing herself she had nothing left to give. Now suddenly, everyone wanted something. And with attention came resentment. Some officers bristled openly, muttering that a janitor had no business advising command. Others sneered behind her back, suggesting the general's salute had been some kind of pity gesture. A few even confronted her directly, voices sharp with defensiveness. "You're not one of us anymore," one captain said flatly as she passed him in the hall. "So maybe stop acting like it." The words cut, more than she wanted to admit. Angela returned to her closet that night, staring again at the cedar trunk. She pulled the uniforms out, touched the stripes on the sleeves, and asked herself the question that gnawed daily now. Who am I? A janitor, a sergeant, a ghost trying to live between both worlds. The uncertainty weighed on her, but so did something else, a new kind of responsibility. The recruits had listened to her. She couldn't forget the way their eyes had locked on her every word. She had given them something real, and walking away now felt like betrayal. But speaking meant reliving, reliving meant remembering, and remembering hurt. The tug-of-war left her exhausted. And then came the summons. She was asked, formally this time, to sit in on a strategy session for updating maintenance doctrine. It wasn't optional. The request carried the quiet force of command. Angela balked. She considered refusing outright, but she knew what that would mean. To refuse would be to return to invisibility. To accept would be to step back into a world she thought she had left behind. So she went. The conference room was bright, sterile, lined with polished wood and filled with uniforms. Colonels, majors, engineers, men and women half her age but brimming with authority. Angela stood near the back, coveralls marking her as out of place among pressed blues and gleaming pins. The meeting began. Charts flashed on the screen. Acronyms spilled like a second language. Angela folded her arms, listening. It didn't take long for the frustration to set in. They were talking in circles, discussing problems she had lived through as if they were theories on paper. She clenched her jaw, fingers digging into her sleeve. She wanted to stay silent. She told herself to stay silent. But then one of the engineers made a suggestion, so naive it made her blood run hot. "That procedure is suicide," she blurted before she could stop herself. The room froze. Dozens of heads turned. Angela felt the burn of their stares, but she didn't back down. She stepped forward, voice firm. "You can't bypass a turbine inspection like that under combat conditions. You'll lose the engine. You'll lose the pilot. I've seen it happen." The colonel leading the session frowned. "And you are." For a moment the room seemed to tilt. Angela could have swallowed the words, could have retreated, but instead she lifted her chin. "Master Sergeant Angela Torres, retired." A ripple moved through the room. The colonel blinked, recognition dawning. And then, reluctantly, he gestured for her to continue. Angela stepped closer to the table. She explained what she'd seen in Afghanistan, the way dust fouled intakes, the way command pressure led to rushed decisions, the way those decisions cost lives. She spoke with the sharp precision of someone who had lived it, not studied it. By the time she finished, the room was silent. The colonel cleared his throat. "Point taken." Angela stepped back, heart pounding. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also alive. For the first time in years, she had spoken with authority. After the meeting, one of the younger officers caught up with her in the hallway. He was respectful but blunt. "They won't all like you," he said. "Some don't want reminders of what they don't know, but don't let that stop you." Angela nodded faintly, though the words churned in her chest long after he walked away. That night she sat again at her kitchen table, but this time she poured herself a glass of whiskey she hadn't touched in months. She held it up, staring at the amber liquid, and whispered, "Why now?" Why was the past clawing back at her after all these years? Why couldn't the salute have been just a moment, a kind gesture, instead of a spark that threatened to set her whole life ablaze? She thought of the recruits, of the boy in the front row, of the way his eyes had shone when he said thank you. And she thought of the pilot lost in Afghanistan, the failure she carried like a scar. Was she dishonoring him by speaking again? Or was she honoring him by making sure no one repeated the same mistake? The whiskey burned down her throat, but the question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Days passed. The requests multiplied. Angela found herself pulled deeper into training, into doctrine reviews, into conversations she never expected to have again. She gave advice reluctantly, but when she spoke, they listened. Not everyone, though. Some grew colder. One evening, as she left the hangar, she found the word janitor scrawled across her locker in black marker. The letters were jagged, angry. Angela stared at it for a long moment, her fists clenched. Shame and anger warred in her chest. She almost scrubbed it clean herself, but then she stopped. No. She left it there, a reminder of where she stood, of who she was and who she had been. A janitor, yes. A sergeant, yes. Both. Neither diminished the other. But deep down, she knew the resentment would grow. Recognition had a price, and sooner or later she would have to decide if she was willing to pay it. That night, as she lay awake, the question returned again. Who am I now? And for the first time, she whispered the answer into the darkness, tentative but real. I'm both. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Angela had always believed she could compartmentalize, lock away memories, seal them in boxes both literal and mental, and move forward. But the salute had cracked that seal wide open, and the more the base pulled her into the light, the more the ghosts poured out. Whispers trailed her now wherever she went. Some carried respect, others carried resentment, but the worst were the ones laced with jealousy. She overheard them in the cafeteria, the hangar, even the women's restroom when they thought she wasn't there. She's just a janitor. Griggs was being polite, nothing more. She thinks she's one of us again. She's not. Angela bore it in silence, just as she had borne everything else. But inside, the old wounds reopened. One afternoon, she returned to her locker to find the word ghost scratched deep into the paint. The letters cut like knives. Ghost, invisible, half dead, half forgotten. She stared at it a long time, jaw tight, hands shaking. And then slowly she reached up and traced the letters with her finger, not erasing, not hiding, just acknowledging. Because maybe that was what she was, a ghost of who she had been. But ghosts, she realized, still have stories. The tension reached its breaking point a week later. She had been asked to observe a live training exercise, young mechanics practicing rapid field repairs on a grounded jet. Angela stood back, arms crossed, letting them work. At first, things seemed smooth, but then she noticed it, a mistake, small, easy to overlook, but deadly if ignored. She called out, "Stop." The recruits froze. The officer in charge frowned, annoyed. "What's the problem?" Angela stepped closer, pointing to the intake valve. "It's misaligned. You start her like that, you'll shred the engine in under 2 minutes." The officer bristled. "We've got it under control." "No, you don't," Angela shot back. "You'll burn out the turbine and ground your bird for weeks, or worse, you'll send a pilot up to die." The officer's face reddened. "With respect, ma'am, this is my training session." Angela's voice hardened. "With respect, Captain, I buried friends because of that exact mistake. Don't tell me you've got it under control." The silence that followed was suffocating. The recruit stared wide-eyed. The officer clenched his jaw, humiliated. Finally, he snapped, "Fine, fix it." Angela crouched down, hands steady as she realigned the valve. She showed them the trick, gentle pressure at the joint, a twist of the wrist, a patience that came only with years of practice. The part clicked into place. She stood wiping grease on her coveralls. "Now it's ready." The officer said nothing. His silence was worse than words. Later that evening, she was called into her supervisor's office again. This time, the man's voice was strained, uneasy. "Angela, you're making waves." She frowned. "By keeping pilots alive." "That's not what I mean. Some officers don't appreciate being corrected in front of recruits. They'd rather let mistakes slide." He sighed. This isn't about right or wrong, it's about politics, rank, respect. You're disrupting the balance. Angela leaned forward, eyes sharp. If the balance means losing lives, then maybe it deserves to be disrupted. The supervisor swallowed, unable to meet her gaze. Just tread carefully, that's all I'm saying. Angela left the office with her chest tight. Rage simmered beneath her skin, not at the recruits, not even at the officer, but at the system. The same system that had pressured her into rushing a repair years ago, the same system that had cost a young pilot his life. And that night, the memory returned in full force. It was Afghanistan. She was on the flight line, crouched under the belly of the F-16, sweat and sand stinging her eyes. The engine had been damaged badly. She told them it wasn't ready. She begged for more time, but command's voice had been sharp, unforgiving. It flies or we fail the mission. So she had worked through the night. Her hands moved on instinct, patching what she could, praying it would hold. When the dawn broke, she had saluted the pilot, watching him climb into the cockpit with a grin that tried to mask his fear. She remembered the roar as the jet took off, dust exploding beneath its wheels. She remembered standing on the tarmac, heart pounding, whispering, "Please come back." And she remembered the silence, the deafening silence when the radio crackled, then cut off forever. She had fallen to her knees that day, fists pounding the earth, rage and grief tearing through her. But when the medal was handed to her weeks later, no one mentioned the pilot's name. No one mentioned her warnings. The system moved on, and so did everyone else. Everyone except her. Angela woke from the memory gasping, drenched in sweat. She stumbled to the sink, splashing water on her face, gripping the edges until her knuckles whitened. "You can't keep carrying this," she whispered to her reflection. "You can't." But she knew she would. The guilt was part of her now, carved into her bones. The next morning she walked into the hangar early, before anyone else arrived. The jet stood in silence, hulking shadows under the dim lights. She ran her hand along the cold metal of one fuselage, whispering like a confession. "I failed him." Her voice cracked, "But I won't fail them." That day she spoke again to the recruits, not about machines, not about bolts or valves, about responsibility, about the weight of choices. "Someday," she told them, "you'll be ordered to cut corners, to rush, to push a machine past its limits because someone with more rank says the mission matters more. And you'll feel torn. But listen to me, machines don't lie. If you know it's not safe, if you know it's not right, speak up. Fight back. Because the alternative is carrying a silence that never leaves you." The recruits sat frozen, her words pressing down on them like the weight of the desert heat she described. She didn't tell them the full story, but she didn't need to. They felt it. Afterward, one of them approached quietly, the same boy who had thanked her before. His voice was low. "Sergeant Torres, did you lose someone?" Angela's breath caught. Her instinct was to shut down, to deflect. But instead, she forced herself to meet his eyes. "Yes," she whispered, "and I never want you to feel what I felt." The boy nodded, eyes shining. "Then I'll remember." Angela turned away, blinking hard. That night she sat at her kitchen table again. But this time the metal on the table no longer mocked. It no longer gleamed with guilt. It glimmered with something else. A reminder. A burden, yes, but also an oath. She lifted it, holding it in her palm, and whispered, "You deserved better, but maybe I can still give better to them." For the first time in years, the weight didn't crush her. It steadied her. And with that realization came a truth she could no longer ignore. The salute hadn't been just a memory, it had been a call. And she had answered. How far can one salute carry? Angela asked herself that question more often now. It had been weeks since the hallway moment with General Griggs, but its echo hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown louder. She was no longer invisible, and that truth was both a gift and a curse. The recruits adored her. They began to ask for her by name, waiting for her to walk into the hangar. Some even called her ma'am with a reverence that made her uncomfortable. She corrected them when she could. "It's Torres," she would say, or if she was feeling softer, "Angela." But they clung to Sergeant as if the word gave them courage. Her voice mattered now. When she spoke, they leaned in. When she warned, they listened. And when she told them about responsibility, the kind that keeps people alive, the kind that costs sleep, they wrote her words like scripture. But not everyone welcomed her presence. The resentment simmered. The officer she corrected in front of recruits avoided her entirely now, his jaw tightening whenever she entered the room. Others whispered louder, no longer bothering to hide their contempt. "She's just riding the general's memory. She's dangerous, undermines the chain of command. She should have stayed a janitor." Angela heard it all, pretended not to, but each word landed like a bruise. Then came the letter. It arrived in an envelope, no return address, slipped under her apartment door one evening. She tore it open with calloused fingers, her eyes narrowing as she read. "Stay in your place. You don't belong here anymore." No signature, no name, just cold ink on cheap paper. Angela sat heavily at her table, the letter trembling in her hands. The metal beside her caught the light as if watching. She wanted to dismiss it, to laugh maybe at the cowardice of anonymity, but she couldn't. The words cut too deep. They mirrored the doubts she already whispered to herself in the dark. Maybe they were right, maybe she didn't belong. But then she thought of the boy in the front row, of his promise to remember, of the recruits who scribbled her words in notebooks, carrying them like shields. And she whispered to the letter, her voice steady despite the shake in her hands, "I belong wherever truth belongs." The next day she walked into the hangar with her shoulders squared. If they wanted her silent, they would be disappointed. Her influence began to spread in ways even she didn't expect. Maintenance crews on the flight line started adopting her methods, citing Torres' check as shorthand for double verifying safety steps. Recruits quoted her in drills, reminding each other, "Machines don't lie." It wasn't just the young who noticed. A few senior NCOs approached her quietly, thanking her for voicing truths they had long swallowed. "We can't say it," one confided. "Too much risk, but you already walked away once. They can't take anything from you now." Angela shook her head. "They can still take plenty." But the NCO smiled grimly. "And yet you speak." For the first time in years, Angela felt something stirring in her chest beyond guilt. Not pride, not exactly. Something quieter, stronger, purpose. Still, the backlash escalated. One evening, as she returned to her locker, she found it vandalized again. This time, not just words. Her coveralls hung shredded, slashed by a knife. She stood in the dim light, staring at the ruins of the only uniform she wore now. Her fists clenched, rage surged, but then slowly she let out a long breath. "They want me angry," she murmured. "They want me broken." She picked up the torn fabric, folded it carefully, and placed it in her locker. A wound, yes, but also a reminder that her voice mattered enough to threaten. The next morning, she wore a fresh set of coveralls, walked into the hangar with her head high. And when the recruits asked about the cuts on her old uniform, she didn't hide it. "This is what happens when truth makes people uncomfortable," she told them. "And you'll face the same one day. Decide now if you'll stand anyway." The hangar fell silent. Then one by one the recruits nodded. Angela's influence reached even further than she realized. General Griggs returned to the base weeks later. This time, the inspection was quieter, less formal, but when he passed her in the hallway, he stopped again. "Sergeant Torres," he said warmly, the faintest smile tugging at his lips, "I hear you've been busy." Angela straightened, trying not to be. Griggs chuckled. "You've never been one to hide, Torres, not really, even when you thought you were invisible." She wanted to argue, to tell him invisibility had been her only refuge, but she couldn't, because maybe he was right. Maybe the ember had been waiting all along for a spark. He leaned closer, voice low. They won't all thank you, some will fight you, but don't stop. The Air Force needs voices like yours, especially now. Angela swallowed hard. I don't know if I'm ready. His eyes softened. No one's ever ready, that's why it matters. He moved on, leaving her in the hallway with his words echoing like the roar of engines across the desert sky. That night, Angela sat at her table again. The torn coveralls lay folded beside the metal, relics of 2 lives she had tried to keep apart. She stared at them for a long time before whispering into the quiet. I'm not just one or the other, I'm both. The truth felt steady now, no longer tentative. She was both the janitor and the sergeant, the woman who swept floors and the woman who kept planes alive, the invisible and the unforgettable. And maybe, just maybe, that was her strength. Still, she knew the fight wasn't over. The backlash would grow, the resentment would sharpen, and sooner or later someone would demand she step back into silence. But Angela had made her choice. She would not go quietly. What does dignity look like when the world finally sees it? The question haunted Angela as she walked the halls of the base. The week since the salute had changed everything. Her work, her silence, her very identity. She wasn't invisible anymore, but visibility carried a cost. Every glance, every whisper, every note of resentment etched itself deeper into her. And yet she carried on. She trained recruits with quiet authority. She corrected mistakes that could have cost lives. She endured the vandalism, the letters, the stares, because she had decided something important. She would not hide again. But the real test came sooner than she expected. It was supposed to be a routine demonstration. A group of recruits and junior officers were scheduled to run a live turbine test on a C-130. Angela stood back, arms folded, watching. She wasn't there to interfere, only observe. At first, everything seemed fine. The procedures were followed step by step. But then Angela noticed it. A sound. A subtle tremor in the hum of the engine. Her stomach dropped. Shut it down, she called. The recruits glanced at each other, hesitant. The officer in charge frowned. It's within spec, ma'am. Nothing to worry about. Angela shook her head sharply. Shut it down now. The officer hesitated. He didn't want to be embarrassed again, not in front of recruits, not by a janitor. His pride outweighed his caution. And in that hesitation, the engine screamed. A burst of metallic grinding tore through the air, followed by a shudder that rattled the hangar walls. The recruits flinched, covering their ears. Smoke poured from the intake. Shut it down, Angela roared. This time they obeyed. The engine wound down with a groan, smoke spilling into the rafters. Silence followed. The officer's face was pale, jaw tight. He knew what had almost happened. Everyone did. Angela stepped forward, voice steady but soft. Machines don't lie. When they speak, you listen, or someone pays the price. The recruits nodded, wide-eyed, scribbling her words as if carving them into stone. Even the officer, humiliated, lowered his gaze. That night, Angela returned home exhausted. She poured herself a glass of water, sat at the table, and laid the medal in front of her again. She thought of the pilot who had died. She thought of the silence she had carried for years. And for the first time, she felt something shift inside her. The medal wasn't guilt anymore. It wasn't shame. It was a reminder that silence can kill, but truth can save. She whispered into the quiet, I won't be silent again. Days later, the base held a recognition ceremony. Not for Angela, at least not officially. It was for the recruits who had completed their training. Families filled the hangar, flags hung high, brass polished until it gleamed. Angela stood at the back, mop in hand, sweeping near the bleachers. She hadn't been invited. She hadn't expected to be. She was content to watch, invisible again in the crowd. But then something happened. As the ceremony ended, the recruits lined up to receive their certificates. One by one, they walked across the stage, saluted the presiding officer, and shook hands. And then, without prompting, without planning, they turned. Turned to the back of the hangar. Turned to her. And saluted. One by one, a line of young airmen raising their hands to their brows, their eyes steady on the woman with the mop. The crowd rippled with confusion. Murmurs spread. The presiding officer frowned, uncertain what was happening. But Angela knew. Her throat tightened. Her chest ached. Slowly she lowered the mop, straightened her back, and raised her hand in return. The hangar held its breath. It wasn't official, it wasn't scripted, but it was real. Because respect doesn't always come from medals or speeches or polished uniforms. Sometimes it comes from those who see the truth and choose to honor it. Angela lowered her hand, eyes burning. The recruit smiled faintly, proud, unashamed. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. She wasn't just the janitor, she wasn't just the sergeant, she was both. And being both didn't diminish her, it made her whole. Later, as the crowd dispersed, General Griggs found her again. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her, watching the recruits pack their gear. Finally, he said quietly, "They'll remember you long after they've forgotten me." Angela shook her head. "I'm just doing my part." Griggs smiled faintly. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and when it does, people notice. He saluted her one last time before walking away. Angela stood there, mop in hand, staring at the recruits laughing with their families. And for the first time in years, she felt something lift from her chest. The guilt was still there, the memories were still sharp, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was the choice she had made, the choice to step out of silence, to pass on what she knew to be both the ghost and the guide. She walked out of the hangar into the evening air, the sound of engines humming faintly in the distance. She looked up at the sky, contrails slicing across the fading light, and whispered to herself one final truth. You were never invisible. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.